There is a particular kind of sadness that settles over you when something you love disappears not because it ran its course, but because someone decided it was too inconvenient to keep alive. That is exactly what is happening right now with The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and if you have been paying even the slightest attention to what has unfolded over the past several months, you already know that this story is about far more than a television program being quietly retired. This is a story about power, about money, about the price of speaking honestly in a media landscape that grows more fragile and more frightened by the year, and about one man who spent over a decade proving that sincerity and sharpness do not have to be enemies. Stephen Colbert did not just host a talk show. He occupied a very specific and necessary space in American public life. Every weeknight, millions of people tuned in not just to laugh, though they did laugh, but to feel like someone in a position of visibility was actually paying attention, was actually bothered, was actually willing to say the thing out loud. And now that voice is going quiet, not because Colbert wanted it to, not because the audience had walked away, but because the corporation that owned the platform made a calculation, and that calculation said he was more trouble than he was worth. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand how unlikely Colbert's entire career was in the first place. He did not grow up imagining himself behind a late-night desk. He grew up in South Carolina as the youngest of 11 children, and when he was just 10 years old, his life changed in a way that most people would never recover from. His father, James Colbert, and two of his older brothers were killed when Eastern Airlines Flight 212 crashed on approach to Charlotte Douglas International Airport in September of 1974. 96 people died in that accident, and among them were 3 members of Colbert's family. The youngest boy was left to grow up in a household defined by an absence that could never be filled. What Colbert has said about that period of his life, in the rare moments when he has been willing to discuss it publicly, is that his mother became his model for how to survive the unsurvivable. She did not become cold. She did not turn grief into bitterness. She absorbed the loss and continued to love the people around her with the same openness she had always had. That lesson stayed with Colbert. It shaped his emotional vocabulary in ways that later became visible in every serious conversation he had on television, every moment where he paused and let something real sit in the air between him and a guest instead of rushing past it toward the next laugh. He found his way to comedy through theater. He enrolled at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia before transferring to Northwestern University, where he studied performance and graduated in 1986. From there, he moved to Chicago, which at that time in the late 1980s was one of the most fertile grounds for comedic talent anywhere in the country. He joined Second City, the legendary improvisational theater company that had launched the careers of countless people who later became household names. At Second City, he met Amy Sedaris and Paul Dinello, and together the 3 of them developed a creative shorthand that eventually produced a sketch comedy program for Comedy Central called Exit 57 in the mid-1990s. The show did not run long, but it earned nominations and demonstrated that Colbert was capable of building something genuinely original when given the space to do so. He tried to get a writing job on David Letterman's show early in his career and was turned down. That rejection, which must have stung at the time, now reads like one of those pivotal near misses that push a person toward their actual destination. Instead of writing for Letterman, Colbert eventually landed at The Daily Show with Jon Stewart in 1997, initially on a probationary arrangement that became permanent when it became obvious he was exactly what the show needed. Over the following years, he became the program's defining correspondent, a role that required him to walk up to absurdity with a completely straight face and ask it questions as though it were entirely reasonable. He became extraordinarily good at this. He stayed at The Daily Show longer than any other correspondent in its history. The Colbert Report launched in 2005 on Comedy Central as a spin-off of sorts, a concept that could have easily collapsed under the weight of its own premise. Colbert was going to play a character, a pompous, blowhard cable news pundit, and sustain that performance for a full 30-minute program 5 nights a week. The character was a loving and devastating parody of a very specific type of American political media personality, one who performed patriotism and certainty in equal measure while revealing, just by existing, the absurdity of the entire format. The show ran for 9 years and won multiple Emmys and Peabody Awards. It also permanently complicated Colbert's public identity because a significant portion of the audience was never entirely sure whether the man they were watching was the character or the actual person. When CBS announced in 2015 that Colbert would succeed David Letterman as the host of The Late Show, the reaction was mixed. Letterman's run on that program had lasted 22 years and had turned the Ed Sullivan Theater into something close to sacred ground for a certain generation of television viewers. Letterman was prickly and brilliant and chronically dissatisfied, and his show had the texture of something that was always slightly beyond the control of the people making it, which was exactly what made it so compelling. Colbert was different in almost every measurable way. He was warmer, more openly emotional, more comfortable with sincerity. And crucially, he was arriving without the protective armor of a fictional character for the first time in a decade. The first year was rough. The ratings were not good. The critical reception was polite but uncertain. There was a widely discussed post-Super Bowl special in early 2016 that was considered a visible stumble, a high-profile opportunity that did not convert into the momentum the show needed. People inside and outside CBS were beginning to wonder whether the hire had been a mistake. Then November 2016 arrived and everything changed. The presidential election produced an outcome that restructured the emotional landscape of a significant portion of the American population, and Colbert's show found its footing almost immediately in the aftermath. His monologues became more direct, more urgent, more willing to sit with discomfort instead of escaping into easy punchlines. He was not performing outrage. He was expressing something that felt genuinely felt, and the audience could tell the difference. Within the 2016 to 2017 television season, The Late Show had climbed to the top of the late-night ratings, surpassing The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon for the first time in years and reclaiming a position that no CBS late-night program had held since the early years of the Letterman era. What followed was 9 consecutive seasons at number 1. 9 years of finishing at the top of the late-night ratings pile. The show won its first Emmy Award for Outstanding Variety Talk Series in 2025, which happened to be the final season of its existence. The timing of that award, given what we now know about what was happening behind the scenes at CBS and its parent company Paramount, reads like a cruel joke that nobody found funny. The financial picture of late-night television had been deteriorating for years before any of this became public. The traditional business model for these programs was built around advertising revenue tied to viewership in the 11:35 time slot, and that model had been quietly eroding as streaming platforms and digital video consumption rewired how audiences spent their evenings. Even the most viral moments from Colbert's show, the clips that accumulated tens of millions of views on YouTube and spread across every social platform, were not generating advertising dollars that flowed back to CBS because the platforms distributing that content were not CBS. The network was, in a very real sense, producing enormously successful content that it could not fully monetize. By the time CBS began making decisions about the show's future, The Late Show was reportedly losing somewhere in the range of $30 to $40 million annually, depending on which account you believe. One figure circulated widely, another was challenged by sources close to the production as significantly overstated. But even accepting the lower estimate, that is a meaningful financial burden for a single program to carry, and it needs to be acknowledged honestly. The economics of late-night television in the mid-2020s were genuinely difficult, and Colbert's show was genuinely expensive to produce. The problem with the purely financial explanation is not that the numbers are false. The problem is the timing. In the spring of 2025, Paramount, the parent company of CBS, agreed to pay $16 million to settle a lawsuit brought by Donald Trump. The lawsuit centered on a claim that CBS News had selectively edited an interview with Kamala Harris during the 2024 presidential campaign on 60 Minutes, presenting her responses in a way that Trump's legal team argued was misleading and unfairly favorable to her. Trump had long targeted CBS News as hostile to his political interests, and the settlement, announced without CBS or Paramount admitting any wrongdoing, was received by many media observers as exactly the kind of institutional capitulation that happens when a corporation needs something from a federal government. What Paramount needed, specifically, was approval for its pending merger with Skydance Media. That deal required sign-off from the Federal Communications Commission, a regulatory body whose chairman had already made public statements about equal-time broadcasting rules that were widely interpreted as directed at programs like The Late Show. The merger was a transaction worth billions of dollars to Paramount's shareholders. The settlement was $16 million. These are not difficult numbers to compare. 3 days after CBS made the settlement public, Stephen Colbert addressed it on air. He called the payment what it looked like, a bribe. Not a settlement in the traditional sense, not a pragmatic resolution of a legal dispute, but a financial gesture designed to purchase goodwill from a sitting president whose administration controlled the regulatory process that Paramount needed to navigate. He said this plainly and without hedging, which was consistent with how he had conducted his monologues for the better part of a decade. He had never been subtle about where he stood or what he thought. 3 days after that broadcast, CBS announced that The Late Show would be ending. The official statement described the decision as purely financial, driven by the challenging economics of the late-night landscape. The network did not reference Colbert's comments. It did not reference the settlement. It described the cancellation as the kind of business decision that large media companies make routinely when the numbers stop working. The response from people who had been watching the situation closely was immediate and pointed. Senator Elizabeth Warren released a statement calling on CBS to explain publicly whether the show's cancellation was motivated by political considerations. The Writers Guild of America called on the New York State Attorney General to open an investigation into the circumstances of the cancellation, arguing that the sequence of events raised serious questions about whether a media company had sacrificed a program and the jobs of the people who made it in order to curry favor with an administration that held regulatory power over that company's most important pending transaction. The FCC approval for the Paramount-Skydance merger came through shortly after the cancellation announcement. This is a fact. The interpretation of what it means is something each person must decide for themselves. Donald Trump reacted to the news of the cancellation on his social media platform with visible enthusiasm. He celebrated the end of the show, disparaged Colbert's abilities as an entertainer, and then, in a passage that drew considerable attention, suggested that Jimmy Kimmel's program might be the next to go. This was not a veiled comment. It was a public declaration from the President of the United States that he expected and apparently welcomed the removal of television hosts who had been critical of him from the airwaves. Colbert responded on his next broadcast by saying, clearly and without elaboration, that the gloves were off. What followed was one of the most direct monologues of his entire 11-year run, a piece of television that many people who watched it immediately recognized as something they would be thinking about for a long time. The weeks that followed the cancellation announcement became something unexpected. Late-night television is a competitive business, and the people who host those programs are, in a professional sense, rivals. They are chasing the same viewers every night, fighting over the same guests, competing for the same cultural relevance. But as Colbert's final weeks approached, something different happened. Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Seth Meyers, and John Oliver all appeared together on the same episode of The Late Show, a gathering that Colbert described as bringing his best television friends into the same room. He joked with the dry timing that had always been one of his signatures, that Jon Stewart was now the designated survivor, the one who had to stay away in case something happened to the rest of them. Those 5 men had history together that went beyond professional courtesy. During the Writers Guild of America strike of 2023, when the writers who made their programs possible were on the picket lines and the shows were all dark, the 5 of them created a podcast called Strike Force 5. They produced 12 episodes without scripts, without staff, without any of the infrastructure that normally surrounds their work, and donated all proceeds to the crew members and production staff who had lost their income during the work stoppage. The podcast became something people genuinely valued, not because it was polished, but because it was real. 5 people who had built careers in a particular corner of American entertainment talking honestly about what that corner was becoming. David Letterman came back to the Ed Sullivan Theater. He walked into the building he had rebuilt and made into a landmark, took his place in front of an audience that gave him a standing ovation, and made clear that he had not made peace with what had happened. He told the room that they owed their presence in that building partly to him, which was true, and that whatever CBS had decided to take away, they could not take away a person's voice or character. He paraphrased the legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow in a closing line that said everything it was meant to